Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Monday everybody. I hope you had a good weekend and as always have a productive week ahead. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrived in China over the weekend to begin 2 days of meetings with officials starting yesterday, Sunday. Blinken, who is the first Secretary of State to visit China since 2018, has already met with China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang. We will unpack the details of the visit and its implications for US-China relations in tomorrow's video after it has concluded. For today, though, we will focus on developments related to a topic we've been following for some time now: local fiscal and debt pressures. China's poor and lightly populated southern province, officially a so-called autonomous region, of Guangxi, has joined Guizhou, Yunnan and Inner Mongolia, becoming the latest provincial-level government in serious financial difficulty, perhaps even in a state of de facto bankruptcy. That is to say, unable to meet financial obligations without central government support. Earlier this month, Guangxi, not to be confused with the much wealthier and dynamic Guangdong, home to the Pearl River Delta, issued a draft policy document aimed at regulating investments made by local governments in the region, and setting a warning line for their debt to gross domestic product ratios at 300%. This warning line in of itself is quite concerning, as it is much higher than the international standard of between 100 and 120%. The document forbids local governments in the region with a debt-to-GDP ratio above that threshold from starting any new government-funded projects. Even emergency rescue and disaster relief projects are not permitted unless approval is granted from the central government. It is clear from these strict rules that Beijing is deeply troubled by the fiscal condition of local governments in the region. Wen Laicheng, a professor at the Central University of Finance and Economics, speaking to Chinese financial media outlet Yicai Global, told the outlet that the 300% warning line, quote, likely took local governments' implicit debts into account, end quote, adding that, quote, the draft policy clearly defines the difference between government investments and those of state-owned enterprises, noting that local authorities must avoid making investments via SOEs, which inevitably increases their implicit debt burden, end quote. According to its 2023 budget report, Guangxi's official provincial-level debt-to-GDP ratio was 144% in 2022. Above international standards of warning lines, but well below the 300% limit imposed in these new rules. On these numbers, its fiscal revenue-to-debt ratio was 0.7%, enough to cover more than half of its liabilities. However, these numbers exclude implicit debts, which analysts warn are likely very high. We remember in a recent Goldman Sachs Group report, the US bank estimated that China's total government debt in 2022 was about $23 trillion. More on the local fiscal crisis later in the video. But next up, over the weekend, the US Treasury published its semi-annual foreign exchange watchlist, which found that 7 major economies, including China, were on its so-called monitoring list for currency practices, but did not designate China as a foreign exchange manipulator. The monitoring list includes China, South Korea, Germany, Malaysia, Singapore, Switzerland, and Taiwan. Economies that, quote, merit close attention to their currency practices and macroeconomic policies, end quote. With the release of the report, Treasury Secretary Yellen expressed, quote, most foreign exchange intervention by U.S. trading partners last year was in the form of selling dollars, actions that served to strengthen their currencies, end quote. In relation to China specifically, a Treasury spokesperson expressed with the release of the report, quote, China's failure to publish foreign exchange intervention and broader lack of transparency around key features of its exchange rate mechanism make China an outlier among major economies and warrant Treasury's close monitoring, end quote. Back in 2019, the Trump administration designated China as a foreign exchange manipulator. However, the administration dropped the label 5 months later as part of the Trump-era trade deal made with Beijing. The designation in of itself doesn't really carry much weight, however, as it simply triggers a requirement for the administration to, quote, engage with those trading partners to address the perceived exchange rate imbalance. End quote. Next up, another troubling practice we need to cover as we turn back to local debt issues. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. Sharing and subscribing is a huge help as well. It's only me making these episodes every day. It's a lot of work, but your guys' support is a huge source of motivation, so thank you very much. As always, anyone who can go that extra mile and help keep the channel sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. There is also the super thanks function in YouTube itself. As always, thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. It appears that in some localities across the country, cash-strapped local governments are turning to a deeply unpopular mechanism in order to increase fiscal revenue, imposing large fines. It's hard to know how widespread this practice has become, but some anecdotal cases have already blown up online, sparking controversy domestically. One example, which attracted over 10 million views within 24 hours on Weibo and sparking angry criticism online, was the case of a Shanghai restaurant being fined 5,000 yuan, $700, for serving shredded cucumber without a license. Another high-profile example was that of truckers in central China's Henan province who accused local authorities of tampering with vehicle weighing machines in order to impose fines for being overweight. They may be justified in these concerns too. In August of last year, officials in Guangdong province were found to have falsified evidence to fine trucks for suspected illegal dumping. Is this occurring systematically across the country, or are these simply isolated examples? Some commentators argue that it's no coincidence that these cases are coming to public attention just as local fiscal issues reach crisis points. Quote, these high-profile scandals represent a broader trend of local governments using fines to bolster their coffers. A state council inspection last year found that in the wake of the pandemic and other economic difficulties, local government penalties had become stricter and more severe. End quote. Indeed, back in February, the then Premier Li Keqiang at a cabinet meeting criticized the practice of some local areas of using expensive parking fines to make revenue, calling on officials to, quote, resolutely put an end to arbitrary fines, end quote. According to an analysis of government data by Caijing Industry Research Center, Guangxi, the province which we just discussed in part 1 of today's episode, made 13 billion yuan from fines in 2022, equivalent to an incredible 14% of its tax income, up over 60% versus 2021. This does not appear to be a coincidence. Others agree. Quote, it is a sign of desperation. Arbitrary fines and predatory behavior will drive businesses away, especially small and medium businesses, without the political protection of large state-owned enterprises. End quote. And if local fiscal conditions continue to worsen, this trend likely will too. Quote, fees and fines are going to become more visible with economic growth slowing, as these are things local bureaucrats have control over on a day-to-day basis. End quote. In addition to the obvious issues with this kind of behavior being very unjust, there is also a deeply negative systemic effect. The poorest regions have the worst fiscal conditions, making it more likely that officials in these regions will turn to this dubious extra budgetary practice. This in turn will have a retarding effect on local business activity, as large businesses move away and small businesses either shut down or are not opened in the first place. Thus, the poorest regions, which need this business activity the most, are also the most likely to suffer from the negative systemic effects of predatory fining behavior. Quote, as fines and other regulatory burdens kill off the small and medium enterprises, local governments would further lose tax income, become even more reliant on fines, and dependent on transfers from central and other upper-tier governments. This could be detrimental to the local business environment and result in a vicious cycle in weak regions. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a wonderful day, have a productive week, and I will see you all tomorrow.